Hello everybody. I'm delighted to be here in what promises to be a very, very exciting week in politics and possibly in the history of our nation. In a couple of days' time, Scotland votes. And at one stage, it really looked like Scotland was going to make a momentous decision about its future without anyone really having noticed up to the day of polling. Then about 10 days ago, my own newspaper, as it happens, could have been another newspaper, but we ran an opinion poll which showed the yes vote 4 points in the lead, and the political class went bananas, and the campaign came on fire. At the end of the day, though, how much influence is that going to have when people actually cast their ballots? So it's an interesting time to be discussing what influence does the press really have on current events in times that are really very important to us. So here to discuss it with me, I'll start over there. There's Steve Richards. Steve Richards and I once shared a job, not at the same time, but we were both political editors of the New Statesman. But he's also covered broadcasting as well as print journalism. He was a former BBC political correspondent, and then he went on to become a very distinguished commentator for The Independent, although he's probably most proud of his one-man, what's it called again, Steve? Rock and roll politics.
My one-man show, coming to Manchester soon.
There you go, you've heard it here first. And on my far left over there is Rick Nye, who is managing director of the polling firm Populous, which does a number of polls, including for the Times. But he also has direct experience of how politicians are affected by opinion polls, because he was head of a think tank, the Social Market Foundation, a centre-right think tank, and then went and worked as director of the Conservative Research Department, and so he has advised several Tory leaders directly. On my right here, Nick Watts, political correspondent for The Guardian, and who's been in the lobby for many years, but also has covered Brussels for his paper, and has been an Ireland correspondent, so he's covered all sorts of different politics for The Guardian, including how to cover an institution that is very important in our lives like the EU, and yet is a massive bureaucracy that's incredibly difficult to shift, and our own political world here in the UK. And then I've got Nigel Nelson on the left, who has been covering politics for, since 1986.
Since the Boer War.
Okay, there you go. He's counted in prime ministers, he's counted them out. He could even count out another one at the end of this week if Scotland votes yes to independence. We'll see about that. Anyway, a great panel. Now, first of all, I just want to ask you, Nigel, in all your years of counting them in and out, what stories have you been working on that have had the most influence, would you say?
Okay, I plucked a story out of the past, not because it's the biggest thing that I've ever covered, but simply because it shows how newspapers influence events because of the way that they open up access to the people that matter. 1988, O-levels had just been abolished in favour of GCSEs. Year one was total and utter chaos. A young girl killed herself because of the stress. Textbooks didn't arrive in the right places, so the kids hadn't studied for the exams. Exam papers were switched around, so they didn't get the right ones. The whole thing was complete chaos. At the Sunday People, we laid that responsibility directly to the Education Secretary of the day, who was Kenneth Baker. Few weeks of coruscating articles and editorials in the paper, and I get a call from Ken's special advisor, broadly saying, what does it need to call the hounds off? The answer was that the Secretary of State had to sit down with 4 kids from different parts of the country so they could explain to him face to face exactly what they'd been going through. We set up the meeting, in we trooped. In came a very grumpy Secretary of State that he felt he'd been railroaded into what was a newspaper stunt. But he sat there, he'd scheduled the meeting for 20 minutes, he sat there and he listened to the kids describe the horrors they'd been through, the ones who hadn't got the right textbooks, the ones who hadn't got the right exams. In the room was the official who was in charge of the curriculum and another official in charge of the exams. Every so often, on the basis of what the kids were saying to him, he'd turn around to them and say, "Is that right? Is that right?" And they kept saying, "Well, actually, Secretary of State, yes, it is." What became clear is that he had no idea of the extent of the problem. And it was thanks to these kids coming in and speaking to him. He didn't get the chance to do that as a normal part of work in his ivory tower. Because they'd come in and spoken to him, he began to understand what they had been going through. For months afterwards, I saw things that those youngsters had said turning up in his speeches. And the following year, everything went absolutely smoothly. Don't know how much of a part we played in that, but I do like to think that meeting really achieved something.
Thank you very much. What about you, Steve? I'm going to ask everyone in turn, I think, about this.
Well, I can give less constructive examples in a way. I mean, I think you can measure very clearly, for example, the power of newspapers in relation to some of the cabinet resignations that took place under the Labour government. There have been very few cabinet resignations under this government, but the resignations, for example, extraordinary theatre and drama at the time of Mandelson, Blair's closest friend, was unquestionably media-driven and newspaper-driven. And I think that's now broadly agreed to have been the case. I mean, that's a specific example of newspaper power, but you could also measure it in terms of the way we all perceive issues still to this very day. There's absolutely no doubt at all, in my mind, that our attitudes to Europe are partly shaped still by newspapers. And I've no doubt at all that in the referendum in Scotland, newspapers have played a part in the last few days in framing and shaping opinion, arguably both ways. I read a column on Sunday from a columnist who used to work at the BBC with me called Ian McWhirter, who's a really modest, moderate guy then. Someone told me he'd got religion, and I read his column in favour of a yes vote on Sunday. And I reckon that will have had some impact with quite a few undecided people. But on the other hand, most newspapers have blitzed Scotland with a no campaign, and that will have some impact as well. I think in a whole range of areas, newspapers continue to have a huge impact on the way we look at things, politics specifically.
Do you agree, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think the example I would give is because Nigel's given a really strong example of how a newspaper did actually have a huge impact on public policy. The example I'd give of influence raises the question of who influences whom between politicians and the press, or indeed who uses whom. This is a decade after Nigel's story, and this was in 1997 when Gordon Brown decided to announce that the UK would not be joining the euro unless it was subject to the 5 tests that he dreamt up with Ed Balls in the back of a taxi in New York. I was a political correspondent on the Times then, and the political editor came in on the Friday when I was the duty person and said, "Oh, I've got a bit of an important story here. It's going to be written very, very carefully, but don't worry, the headline will have a huge headline." And the headline, "Brown says no to the euro." And the story was written in a very, very cautious way because of all the negotiations that go on in these situations. And later that night, I had to sort of cover the blowback of that story and was phoned by a very excited Lib Dem press officer who said, "I've just been at the Red Lion pub on Whitehall where Charlie Whelan," who you may remember, that was Gordon Brown's great spinner, great Cockney spinner, was blurting out that they'd basically stuffed Tony and Peter, which was Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson. And I said to him, "Well, I think the reason for this is if you look at our front page tomorrow, because in these days there was no internet, there was no tweeting, I think you'll have the answer for why he's so excited." And he went, "OK, I'll go and look at it." And he went down to Charing Cross Station, bought a copy of the front page and said, "Well, I don't understand why everyone's so excited. The story is written so cautiously," because it was written in that way, because it was sort of long negotiations over how that story would be written. So that was influential in the sense of that was the moment when essentially Gordon Brown gave himself a veto over our Euro membership, which meant eventually that we didn't join, and we probably won't join in this generation or indeed the next. But it also raises the interesting question of who influences whom and who uses whom in that instance. The Time had a stunning political story. Gordon Brown got his message out. But just to get back to what Steve is saying about Scotland, I mean, I think you're going to ask me at the end, so I'm now going to preempt what I'm going to say at the end. You know, what will the vote be? My instinct is it will probably be a no vote. But if it is a yes vote, you'll have had almost every paper, apart from the Sunday Herald and the Scottish Sun that's playing games, going for a no vote. And if it is a yes vote, it feels a bit like it would be Ken Livingstone in 2000. Every single paper said, do not vote for this man, he's a danger. Even the Daily Mirror said, don't vote for him, he'll be a danger. And the people of London said, no, he won't, we like him. And the rest is history.
That's right. Well, Rick, you've come at it from a different angle. You're not a newspaper man,
No.
but you do understand newspapers and polling and research. When have you seen the most impact?
I think the impact that you see is not a single story that Nigel sort of talks about or that Nick's talks about. It's more the sort of the creation of the mood music. It is certainly true to say that when we talk to people up and down the country, we do focus groups, and politicians are often derided for paying too much attention to focus groups and research in a way that any sort of captain of business wouldn't be. But when you talk to people, yes, it's true that fewer people are taking daily print versions of newspapers, but it's also true to say that all of the anecdotes that they come back to you with are stories that they've gotten from newspapers. So, you know, it was the Daily Mail that highlighted the fact that you could be a Polish migrant worker and claim child benefit and send it back to your child while they were still living in Poland. And that continues to dominate the debate about migration, about immigration, about benefit reform. Even though people know that newspapers have an agenda, they still sup up all of their news about the state of the health service in general, about the state of the school system in general, about the degree to which people are taking advantage of the benefit system in general. All of that mood music is still set by newspapers. And I would argue that one of the sort of the greatest influences that newspapers have is in determining the broadcast agenda. Actually, when you ask people who are the journalists that they most trust, they are not, with respect, print journalists. They are broadcast journalists. They are the Nick Robinsons, the Robert Pestons of this world. But the extent to which Nick Robinson and Robert Peston, particularly perhaps more Nick than Robert, take their cues from what newspapers are writing, that is a powerful secondary source of influence that newspapers have. So I would say there's not a sort of single issue. I mean, we could talk about Scotland and the YouGov poll and what it set off the week before last in a moment. But I would say it is the long-lasting influence of providing ordinary people who don't normally engage with politics with their kind of anecdotal evidence and the lens through which they see the political world.
Yeah, I think newspapers do like to feel that we make the weather, even if now that can be disseminated. It might start in a newspaper, but be disseminated through the digital world. Now, Nigel, you've been reporting a long time. How has political reporting changed over the years?
Well, hugely. I mean, obviously, there is that you mentioned digital. Obviously, that our industry has changed hugely too. So everything is very different. As far as actual political reporting goes, there has been a move over the last 25 years for so-called open government. Politicians love talking about it, so do some journalists. What open government has led to is more closed government. When I first came to Parliament, we were all members of the Parliamentary Lobby, which is a clique of journalists, security cleared, to wander through the corridors of power talking to who we like. That's the theory of it. In the days that I first did it, there were meetings constantly with cabinet ministers. There was a regular briefing at number 10. The difference between then and now is in those days the whole thing was unattributable. What it meant was that there was a freer flow of information. Gradually over the years, this has been whittled away. There's been a move to put politicians on the record all the time. The moment you put somebody on the record, they say an awful lot less. And my submission is that in the days when you were able to talk to them privately, the system worked for both sides. They were able to float, say, an idea before a decision had been made. Through us, using us, and to mention sort of Nick's term, using us to road test a policy, see how it played out there. If it didn't work, they could get rid of it, and no blame was attached to them because their name hadn't come out on it. from our point of view, we got a clearer idea of the direction government was going in, how they were thinking. I would submit that as a result, the public knew more too. What has happened subsequently, although we still have our private meetings with ministers, lavish lunches, take them for drinks, you don't get that same sort of comprehensive view of the way Whitehall and Westminster is working. And as a result of that, I think the public are not as well served now as they used to be.
Just quickly, Rick, on that subject, I mean, could newspapers ever arrogantly claim, as they did 20 years ago, it was the Sun what won it, we have that kind of impact? That's gone, is it?
No, and it wasn't even true at the time. I mean, if you look at the voting breakdown of Sun readers for the 1992 election, it precisely, or almost precisely, replicated what the actual national vote share was. At the last election, when they switched allegiance to the Tories, there was a 13.5% swing among Sun readers from Labour to Conservative, but only a 5% swing nationally. So if it was the Sun what won it, the Conservatives would have won last time. They wouldn't be in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I think often as not, newspapers are not leading their readers so much as being chased down the street by them. They are responding to mood changes that they perceive, and they want to get out, or try and get out ahead of that. I mean, if you go back to 92, clearly, given the mutually antipathy between the trades union movement and Rupert Murdoch, it was really not much of a choice for the Sun to come out and endorse the Tories. There was no risk there, but the fact that the Tories squeaked home and the Sun was able to big up its role in that, well, that's just good news sense. I don't think it's necessarily a profound influence, though.
And what about in Scotland? You were up in Edinburgh doing your one-man rock and roll politics show, but at that time no one down south cared very much what was going on up there. Was that same fever apparent there in Scotland at the time, or has that all been subsequent to newspapers showing just how close the vote is?
It's really interesting. I mean, in Scotland, the summer before last, every Scottish newspaper had the referendum as a front page story every day when I was up there in August 2013. Every comment section had at least one column related to it. The Scottish Newsnight edition, which apparently only about 3 people watch, but it was full of stuff about the referendum. And then you come back down to Westminster and mention the referendum, and they would think you'll be talking about the one on Europe that might never happen. I mean, the contrast was extraordinary. The London-based media have been late to catch up on this one. I mean, I've spoken to comment editors on several papers, say, look, there's something big going on here, and you might as well have been speaking Latin until your poll, frankly. Maybe a bit before then, but not that much before. It's a real example of how the London media and the Scottish media have completely diverged on this story. But it's an example of what Sarah was saying about the power of newspapers on broadcasters. Having started at the BBC, I can completely confirm that. I mean, if you go to the meeting of the World at One, which they all gather at 7:30 in the morning, and their meeting begins at 8:30. And if you go into the room, you can't see any of them because they're just buried in newspapers. And when they have their meeting at 8:30, the subsequent running order has been shaped by what they've just read. And my guess is today, for example, I mean, Nick and I were saying that actually Cameron yesterday went to Aberdeen and delivered, I think, a brilliant speech. It's a very difficult context for him. It was perfectly pitched. But the Times today has got a column, and the Times is very influential in the BBC. I have to say it's a myth that they all read The Guardian. I think they're obsessed with the Times. And it has a column which is deeply critical of Cameron. And the way he's conducted this. Now, I guess is the World at One will follow that column up, and they'll ring around to get a Tory MP to be critical. We'll find one. That Tory MP will go on the World at One. Ian Katz on Newsnight, who's also obsessed with the Times. He came from the Guardian, but wants to show he's not pro-Guardian. He'll follow it up as well and bring the Times columnist on. And so by the end of the day, you could well have a sort of Cameron in deep trouble story. Whereas the reality was, yesterday anyway, he delivered, I think, the best speech I've ever seen him give. And so that's just an example of the way one paper could generate a sequence that changes completely the way we view things.
And even just one column, indeed.
And this is people are not meant to read columns, and maybe they don't, but the BBC reads some, and I can imagine this one being followed up.
And what about younger readers, Nick? You're on a paper that's got a big digital-first strategy. We've got 16-year-olds voting in the Scottish election for the first time. How do you try to pitch your coverage to reflect their interests?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you're writing about this, and I was in Aberdeen yesterday for the Prime Minister's speech, and I'm going back to Edinburgh after this, you're always thinking this is the first time, it's the first time there's an election in which 16 and 17-year-olds will be voting, and you bear that in mind. I think the most important thing to do is not to talk down to them, because these are, you look at the debates that are taking place on TV with 16 and 17-year-olds really engaged, really intelligent. So you don't talk down to them. I think probably the most important thing you've got to have is speed, because they are consuming their news on mobile devices, probably not in newspapers, maybe on desktops, but mainly on iPads and iPhones. So speed, because they come to it through Twitter. You're going to have to be really quick, but also you're going to have to be really credible in what you do. And so I think you've sort of got to sort of stick to, you know, sort of your age-old sort of skills of interpreting things with credibility and authority, but you've got to do it really quickly. Can I just say about Scotland and what Steve was saying? I mean, a year ago, I went off and interviewed Alistair Carmichael, who's the Scotland Secretary, and he gave me a really good story. He said, I've just told the Cabinet that we may lose this referendum, which is quite a big story. Now, we can track everything that we do and how many readers we get. That story was read by 1,200 people, which is almost nobody. Yeah. Now you stick up a story on Scotland, and within an hour or 2 hours, you've got 100,000 people having looked at it. Yeah. Now, why has that happened? What has happened is that Westminster wasn't really alert to it, which is a bit Westminster's in its bubble, but the opinion polls were showing it was safely going to be a no vote. So people thought, well, it's fine, and then it was the YouGov poll that woke people up and woke the rest of the country up, and that's what changed it all.
So we'll see what happens very soon. Meantime, let's throw it open to the floor. Who's got questions? Yes. Oh, hold on a moment, sir, because we can't hear you.
Hello?
Yep, got you loud and clear.
I want to introduce a different dimension to this, which is I think we're in an era of career politicians. And I think the role of newspapers in that era is different, because I think newspapers now amplify public opinion back to politicians who really lack the firm ideology that they used to, and therefore have a different role within the political spectrum that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. Nigel, what do you think?
Well, there's the implied criticism there is of a career politician. I might be saying something unpopular here, but I quite like the career politician as a kind of why not? I find it peculiar, this idea that people have had to have done some specific job before they enter politics. Why, for instance, would a miner be best qualified to run the Ministry of Defence, or a lawyer the Department of Health? It doesn't seem to matter terribly what they've done before. It seems to matter that they understand the nature of Whitehall and Westminster and the business of politics. So I'm not so worried that people like David Cameron, Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg, all have been career politicians, and I don't see any huge difference between their skills and people who came before who did other jobs.
Can I dare to disagree with Nigel?
Of course.
So I'm going to dare to disagree with Nigel. And I think it's a terrible problem that we have politicians who all, I think, to people out there, look just the same. Now, we get really excited in Westminster and we say, but Nick Clegg and David Cameron are really different, because David Cameron went to Eton and Nick Clegg went to Westminster, and we all know they're terribly different. And as for Ed Miliband, he went to, I think it was Haverstock Comprehensive, and people look at them and say, they all look the same. And I do think it's a problem because there was an earlier era, 20 or 30 years ago, where you had politicians who had other lives. You know, Michael Heseltine had a life in business, and he sort of looked like a pretty big beast. Jim Callaghan became Prime Minister at the age of 64, and they looked like big, experienced beasts. And I think the problem with politicians today is because they have either been on the sort of the Westminster treadmill or the they look identical public school treadmill, I do think there's a problem. They look the same. Voting is going down, and I think people are turned off. So I think it is a problem.
Steve, quickly.
I think the problem is slightly different. Being a senior politician now, partly because of the way the media has changed, is much tougher than it used to be. I mean, I was thinking, if you take something like Prime Minister's Questions in the House of Commons, just 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the two protagonists would have no idea how the media had called their exchanges until the sketches in the newspapers the next day. Now on every newspaper website there's a sketch in 5 minutes, there's a verdict on how they did. And this is applied across the board in whatever's going on. And so you have to be really tough and really alert to what is going on and how you should deal with it in terms of how we are covering them. Everything is speeded up. Which means, I think, the problem for the leaders we have now is not that they haven't done anything else, because in a way, when people from business come into politics, they can't handle this. It is a weird, unique world, this kind of one, that politicians now live in. But I think they're getting to the top too young. You know, it's very interesting. Clegg had been an MP for one parliament, and he was then Deputy Prime Minister in the midst of an economic crisis in a weird coalition. I think Cameron had been an MP for one parliament when he became, you know, within 6 months of the next parliament, leader of the opposition. He had been Shadow Education Secretary for about 10 minutes, and that was really it. They haven't had enough. And I was thinking about Cameron's last 48 hours, you know, the risk of losing a referendum, having to speak to the relatives of the poor aid worker killed.
Yeah.
I mean, he must have gone through hell, Cameron. And you need to be very big and developed politically to do all these things and deal with this constant media reportage and interpretation. And none of the three we've got at Westminster are fully developed politicians. You know, it's like arriving at a Wimbledon final aged 8. You know, it's kind of... And I think that is a problem.
Becker won it when he was 17.
Yeah.
Next question. Any more? Yes, you. Oh, wait for the mic. Thank you.
So what you're saying about the BBC being, you know, the reporters being more trusted. There's a programme called Newsworks which is buried somewhere about 7 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, where the public are very critical of the editorial stance of the BBC take on news stories, etc. So I think it's a little unfair, isn't it? What you think really, that I've seen newspapers are criticised for editorial bias, etc., taking a certain stance, yet the BBC seem to get away with it somehow. I don't know. Just your thoughts, really.
I mean, obviously, a programme like that is designed to attract critics. Whether they how representative they are, I don't know. Certainly, when you do polling among the general public, the BBC tends to end up being the most trusted media organisation. But with this caveat, I think if you're a partisan, you always think the BBC is shortchanging you. So you look at something like the coverage of Gaza, and you have demonstrations from the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, or you have counter-demonstrations from the Jewish Leadership Council. You're always in the crosshairs. You've seen it up in Scotland. I mean, there's a reason why they had Nick Robinson on the big banner as they marched past BBC Scotland. Partly, they're trying to neutralise him because they know to the uncommitted, people still look to the BBC to get some sort of steer about, is it safe to vote for an independent Scotland or is it not? And that's why they do what they do. Yeah, the BBC has individual examples of bias, obviously it does, and they get picked up through the complaints process and everything else. But it's still true to say that the BBC has immense power, one, because it has immense reach, two, because by and large, people think it is doing its best to get the story right, and three, there isn't really an alternative in a sort of fragmented media market.
It was an outrageous attack by Rick on us. But I do actually agree with Rick, and I generally always agree with Rick because everything he says is evidence-based. So he really knows what he's talking about. But I do agree with what Rick is saying because, you know, we're different to the United States. In the United States, their papers, I mean, Sarah will know this better than me, you know, their sort of TV stations, their TV news are our sort of angry newspapers, and their it's almost it's in reverse. And the New York Times and Washington Post is sort of the BBC. So the BBC is covered by very, very strict rules on impartiality, and we operate in a different world. I mean, I give you an interesting example. Andy Coulson was hired by David Cameron to be his director of communications. And in that job, he did a very, very, very good job. Obviously, it was his previous job that meant that he went to jail. And
as editor of the News of the World.
As editor of the News of the World, that's right. The insight that he had was a really interesting one for David Cameron that transformed his media operations, which wasn't a newspaper insight, it was a television insight. And he said, because in the old days, what you would do if you were a political party is you'd give a story to one newspaper, they would lead it on their front page, and then the next day, as Steve says, the BBC would pick it up, and because it had been in the paper, it would be number 3 on the 10 o'clock news. Yeah. What Andy said is, let's cut out the middleman, i.e. us lot. And he said, let's go straight to the 10 o'clock news on the BBC or the 10 o'clock news on ITV. We'll give them an exclusive with David Cameron or whatever, and then they would lead the 10 o'clock news. So that is an insight of actually, I know I shouldn't say this as a newspaper person, how, you know, vitally important it is getting your message out onto the main television news broadcast.
More questions? You, sir.
I've got the mic. Hello. I've got the microphone.
Oh, well, in that case, I defer to the man with the mic.
Have you got the mic? It's your turn. Could I ask the panel, please, for their prediction for the referendum?
Well, OK. Steve?
I believe opinion polls. Probably a big mistake, but most of them are still showing a win for no. So I assume that will be the case. When I was up in August, everybody I spoke to, even those who hoped for a yes vote, told me they thought it would be no. I didn't speak to anyone beyond, obviously, the sort of salmons of this world who were telling me it was going to be yes. So I assume it will be a no vote. I have to say I bumped into last night a very distinguished broadcaster who's been up there, and he's absolutely convinced it's going to be yes. So, but I assume it's going to be no.
So you're hedging your bets. What about you, Nigel?
It'll be a no.
One word?
No.
One word?
No.
Okay, next question.
I've got the mic now, sorry. Can I just ask you, how much of an influence do you actually think that the newspapers have on these political people, either prime ministers or, you know, how much of an influence do they have on careers? I mean, I'm going back, obviously there was the expenses debacle a few years ago, but do you think you can influence the careers by what you write?
Okay, Rick, what do you think?
Yes,
You've dealt directly with this.
I think it depends on how strong or weak you are politically to begin with. I mean, I can give you an example. I worked for the Conservative Party during what is commonly known as the night shift, i.e. the years following the 1997 Labour landslide. And in order to keep body and soul of the Conservative Party together, which you may not think is a cause worth fighting for, but more importantly, to remain as its leader, you know, William Hague obsessively courted The Sun, the News of the World, the Daily Mail, because that's what his selectorate and that's what his parliamentary party was reading. It wasn't in order to reach out to swing voters and get a result of the next election. It was simply to make sure that the Conservative Party didn't go and do a Canada and disappear altogether. So there are times when newspapers are incredibly important, partly because of the demographics of the people who still read them. And it tends to be party activists, and it tends to be the people who are the most important stakeholders in your party that pay attention to what's written in newspapers. Among the wider electorate that you actually have to win elections, not so much.
Okay, one more question, and then I think that's all we've got time for. Yes, thank you.
Comment again about sort of Scotland and the influence of newspapers. There's been a lot made in Scotland Rupert Murdoch's flying into Scotland on Sunday or Monday or something, and he's doing a tour of the cities closely followed by Alex. Now obviously the Sun's sort of treading more towards a no vote, but what's your opinion of sort of Rupert's doing it more for his own interests rather than for the interests of Scotland?
I'm sorry, there's a bit of a noise in the back. I heard you say things were trending to a no vote, but I actually lost your question at the end.
Sorry, the Sun seems, I don't know if I'm holding this too close. The Sun seems to have been more towards a no vote, but since Rupert's come into the country, you've seen today's Sun headline, which is very unusual. But do you think his influence could push the Sun's editorial more towards it?
Okay, so the Sun,
the Scottish Sun.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at the makeup, the composition of the readership of the Scottish Sun, you could certainly see why it would be flirting with backing yes. Because the kinds of people who are inclined to vote yes are more heavily represented among the Scottish Sun readers than they are among the Record or the Scottish Daily Mirror. That said, on the other hand, Rupert Murdoch likes to back a winner. And I think what you're seeing there is a sort of a calculation about what the ultimate result is going to be versus the composition of your readership, which is why the Scottish Sun appears to be sitting on the fence at the moment.
I mean, I've been in Scotland for the last 10 days, and I mean, Rupert Murdoch is being a complete tart over Scotland. Sorry, Sarah, I know he's your proprietor. He gave me my first job. I worked for him for 8 years. He went up there, great surprise, in his private jet, sent out all these tweets, and you can tell the Scottish Sun would love to say vote yes. And if you look at their coverage, there was a big piece by their business editor about the absurd scare campaigns by supermarkets. They'd love to vote yes, but they can't quite say it in their editorial column because they know that they have a divided readership. Equally, the Daily Record, which is the most important newspaper in this entire debate at the moment, because it is Labour heartland voters that are going to decide this referendum, you can tell that they would like to say vote no, but they're being very careful about it. But their editorial coverage is pretty fair, but there's quite a no feel to it. And the reason why these papers are being careful is because, as Rick says, it's the readers who lead the newspapers.
But if the Scottish Sun were to endorse yes, I'd have a glass of wine at the very least if I were Alex Salmond, because it would be a kind of, in a minor way, a bit like when they endorsed Labour in '97. It will become a news story. The BBC, quite high up, will report on its bulletins that Murdoch has come out for independence. And it will be quite a fillip. It will, just on the day before, if it were to happen. You seem to suggest it's not going to.
You see, my instinct is that they're not going to.
I think it would have. I mean, Rick suggests no influence. I think it will have a bit, actually. I'd be very pleased if I was Salmond to get that.
There's no secret. There's quite a lot of vigorous debate inside the Sun about this, but it's just going through the same process as a lot of voters are, which is head, heart, what do you think? They really are trying to make up their minds. But we'll have to wait and see. So, look, thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask for one-word answers now just on the other question that's coming up quite soon that will keep us all engaged in politics for some time to come. Who's going to win the next election? Go for it.
Ed Miliband, Prime Minister in a minority Labour government.
Steve?
Yeah, I believe the opinion polls, and it shows a Labour lead, so I assume Labour will either be in a minority government or a very small majority.
Rick?
I think it'll be another hung parliament, but with Labour as the largest party, but maybe the Tories with more votes.
Intriguing. And you, Nick?
Hung parliament with David Cameron as the leader of the largest party.
Okay. Well, there you have it.
It's not an endorsement.
What's your prediction?
You have the cast of votes.
I agree with Nick.
Yeah?
Right.
We'll see, though. You can come and challenge us.
It does mean I disagree with Rick, which is a dangerous thing to do.
It is, very, very much so. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.